What is up, everyone? Welcome to HiFi Turtle, where we talk about everything audiophile. Today I'm talking about a phono preamp. This is the Schiit Skoll. This is the latest and flagship phono pre from Schiit Audio. While many of you are probably familiar with their entry-level Mani, and while the Mani and Mani 2 have been a pillar of performance in the very entry-level budget area of phono pre's, at $399, the Skoll looks to challenge more mid-range and even some of the more high-end phono pre's that are available. The biggest difference between the Skoll and the Mani, at least build-wise, is the fact that the Skoll is a fully discrete design. That means that you're not going to find things like op amps inside of the Skoll. There's also no negative feedback used in this design. What that allows Schiit to do is to run a higher voltage power supply into the Skoll. There is a 48-volt rail for the actual discrete and phono portion of the preamp, but then there is a much lower powered 5-volt rail for the microprocessor section. But the microprocessor is no way in any shape or form in the signal circuit. What the microprocessor section is there for is to be able to change the resistive, capacitive, and gain settings for the phono pre on the fly, which is actually extremely nice. It comes with a remote to be able to change that. You can also do things like turn on and off the rumble filter, as well as switch between single-ended and balanced inputs. Oh, that's also a very big difference with the Skoll. It is a balanced phono preamp. So it will take in a balanced signal and put out a balanced signal. Whether you are using a balanced in or a single-ended in, both outputs are active, so you can still use your XLR cables even if you're not running a XLR in. These are 3-pin XLRs, so if your turntable does have an odd balanced out, such as a 5-pin DIN or something like that, you will need to use an adapter in order to get the balanced input going. But it is really nice to see the balanced input and output on this preamp. And like I said earlier, instead of turning this unit over like the Mani and playing with some dip switches, to change the settings, all you need to do is press a button on a remote. The remote is actually really nice. It is a very cheap plastic remote, which is something that's kind of strange for me to see from Schiit, because typically in their remote offerings, they are the more machined metal remotes. But Schiit says if you lose this one, it's cheaper to replace because it is this cheap little plastic remote. And the reality is that once you dial in your settings for your cartridge, you're probably not going to touch that remote until you buy a different cartridge, another turntable, or you just want to play around and see if you've missed some sort of capacitance setting that may sound better. And that really is some of the magic that's in this phono pre, is the ability to change that on the fly, because to flip over a unit, change some dip switches, go back to your listening position, turn the record on again, being able to A/B what the difference in sound is from a resistive standpoint, from a capacitive standpoint, it gets a little dicey there. But if you're able to just hit a button on a remote, not change your listening position, not change anything, it's a really nice way to be able to A/B and understand what sounds best to you with your cartridge, maybe despite what the cartridge manufacturer actually recommends for that cartridge. As far as your ability to customize those settings, on the resistive side, we have a selection for 10, 50, 100, 150, and 47,000 ohms. On the capacitive side, we have the option for 50, 100, 150, and 200 pif. And then on the gain settings, we have options for 40, 50, 60, and 70 dB. Now, there's not an explicit setting for moving magnet or moving coil cartridges. Typically with moving magnet, you'll probably be at the 40 dB, and on moving coil, you'll be at 60 dB. This is typically the gain increase that you see from a moving magnet to a moving coil. But you do have the options in between in those 10 dB increments to get some more power out of your moving coil or moving magnet, whichever you want to set and whichever sounds best and works for you best. While all these options will work with the majority of cartridges out there, whether they are moving magnet or moving coil, the one thing that you have to think about is that, well, these are the options that the Schiit Skoll offers. So if you have a moving coil cartridge that likes a little bit higher of a loading resistance, like those from Hana, especially something like the EL that is very popular in this kind of class of price, then, well, you could try the Skoll, but again, with a recommendation of greater than 400 loading ohms, it might not be the phono preamp for you in that instance. But if the HANA is just not your flavor and you're more someone who would go for an Ortophon or Audio-Technica, Grado, maybe even Clear Audio, then yeah, this will work for you in the majority of instances. The Skoll only comes in the black finish. There is no silver option for this. While I don't think the unit looks bad in any form or fashion, it definitely is not the most eye-popping, wonderful, luxurious box in the world. But that's just how Schiit rolls. That's their whole modus operandi. They're not trying to be the flashiest and most expensive thing on the market. They want to offer these lower cost, high performance products that just sell a lot because they're really well built and sound really good. So let's talk about the sound of the Skoll. But first, let's talk about the Manny versus the Skoll, because that can be summarized in about 15 seconds. The reason being is that the Skoll is much, much quieter than the Manny. I'll show you right now with no music playing, not even a turntable attached to either unit, how quiet the background is for the Skoll versus the Manny. The Skoll is noticeably quieter than the Manny, and in portions of music where there is a quiet part or there may be a pause, yeah, you can definitely hear that difference very, very obviously. Now I know what you're thinking. I could have rigged this. I could have put some setting on the Skoll or the Manny to make it quieter, to make this not as apparent. Something could have been rigged. I understand. And I'll be perfectly honest with you. The Skoll and the Manny weren't set to the same settings. And I know what you're thinking. Aha! I gotcha. I knew you rigged it. I knew you set this up to make it look like the more expensive component is better than the less expensive component. Typical audio reviewer lies. Well, let me tell you this. It's not possible for the Manny and the Skoll to have the exact same settings because the Manny's gain is set at 33, 48, or 60 dB. The resistance can be set to 38, 47, 200, or 47,000 ohms. The capacitive loading can be set to 47, 94, 147, or 194. If you'll notice, the only setting that the Skoll and the Manny can have in common would be the gain set to 60 and the resistance set to 47,000. In this instance, I had the Skoll set at 40 dB, 47,000 ohms, and 100 pif. The Manny was set at 33 dB, 47,000 ohms, and 94 pif. The absolute closest that I could make the two. And in fact, the Manny in that instance should be a little quieter than the Skoll when you look at purely at the gain setting, where it is 7 dB quieter than the Skoll. But the Skoll is still quieter. Well, I will say the sound that you hear with the Manny is definitely just a hiss. On the Skoll, there is a noticeable kind of static that occurs in the left channel. I've noticed some comments on forums about people saying that this static is sometimes very bad and sometimes hardly noticeable, but it seems to be a very consistent thing with this unit. Personally, until I started seeing those comments, I did not notice this noise at all. And at listening distance, it is not audible at all. Playing music, I don't think it's audible at all. And playing music with very minute detail, I feel like that buzzing kind of goes away. So I'm not sure exactly what's happening here, or if it's just something that kind of goes away when actual sound is going through the unit, and when it's not playing anything, that's when you kind of hear that buzzing a little bit. But I've seen some things where people said they did end up returning the unit to Schiit and get a new unit that had noticeably less buzzing than their original. I haven't seen any statement from Schiit about this at all, so if they do make a statement, I'll try to put something below in the description or maybe in a comment. But until then, it wasn't something that I think is concerning. But moving beyond the Skoll and the Manny comparison, the Skoll does share a lot of the characteristics that the Manny does, and that is very detailed, clean sound that is more modern in taste, doesn't have a lot of warmness or over airiness or kind of more of that ethereal sound, but rather a more modern take on the LP format. While it may not have the widest or deepest soundstage, I definitely think that the details are there, and that music that does have some panning or great imaging does start to shine on the Skoll, especially over the Mani. That being said, there is definitely no glare or harshness ever present. There is still a very meaty and luscious mid-range that comes out, and even the bass notes themselves are very well defined, not muddy at all, definitely not as well defined as I'm used to on a digital playback, but still very enjoyable, very powerful, and very satisfying from an LP collection, something that I can't say that I've really experienced with, at least in my personal listening room, before the Skoll. And one other thing I can say about the Skoll is that it deals with pops and clicks very nicely. I think this is due to the increased headroom because of the discrete build and the high voltage rails that it employs in the phono stage. That gives a nice overload headroom. I think it's more than 20 dB, I believe, if I'm remembering the spec correctly. And that gives a lot of space to where those pops and clicks aren't as noticeable in the music. It doesn't seem like they're a distraction from the music. It seems like they're, I guess, a feature. And with, you know, vinyl playback and analog, definitely those pops, clicks, and hisses are a feature, not a bug. Whether you have the Schiit Mani or another $150 or thereabout phono pre, like from HiFi or other manufacturers, I think the Skoll is a great upgrade and can get you even more enjoyment and faithful reproduction out of your analog collection. I generally have been enjoying my LP collection more when listening to the Skoll, and I'm very happy with this product. I'm very happy to recommend it as well. Although its price is relatively low, it's gotten me into a little trouble because since I'm enjoying my LPs so much, I actually have bought like almost $200 worth of LPs in the last like 2 weeks since getting this thing. So if you buy one, you might save some money over another phono pre, but maybe it'll make you buy some more records because like, man, this sounds so good. I want to buy some more records so I can listen to more stuff. But with that, that's going to do it for me. Like I said, really enjoyed this Schiit Skoll, highly recommend it. If you like this video, please give it that thumbs up. Please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure you check out the links below in the description for other ways to help support the channel. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.